an iconic moment on a World War II battlefield. Victory was in the air. But below this symbol of hope and strength, out of the camera's fleeting view, was a hell called Iwo Jima. And a ferocious battle still raging. This is the story not only of brutal combat, but also of the men on both sides who were transformed by their violent encounter on Iwo Jima 70 years ago. 36 days that would define the Japanese men sent to defend this rock, as well as the young Americans who would conquer it.
I was approaching a pillbox, and he's firing his machine gun, and the bullets are ricocheting off of my flamethrower.
The naval shells were falling to the left and right, sending shrapnel buzzing and whistling through the air around me. "If you're going to hit me, just hit me," I shouted at the incoming shells.
Your insides are spilling out onto the black sands. Nobody is yet on Earth able to rescue you from that.
On the 70th anniversary of the battle, we follow survivors of both sides back to Iwo Jima for a reunion of honor, a ceremony of peace. Filmed by American and Japanese documentary teams, we take you inside the hearts of warriors, once enemies, now friends. I'm Ryan Philippi. In the film Flags of Our Fathers, I had the honor of portraying one of the men who helped raise the American flag over Iwo Jima in 1945. Now, I have the privilege of telling the rest of the story, one that is still unfolding 70 years later. Although the sounds of combat faded long ago, its echoes still reverberate. Iwo Jima is the only battlefield in the world that sees former enemies return together.
Thank you so much.
To remember, to reconcile, to heal. Only on Iwo Jima. In 1945, American forces were fighting their way towards Tokyo to invade mainland Japan. The Japanese knew it and presumed the US would need to capture a tiny volcanic island called Iwo Jima on their inevitable path to the homeland. While the Japanese had no hope of holding the island, they had time to heavily fortify it. Their goal? Inflict as much damage as possible while holding off a US invasion of mainland Japan. The American goal was to control the speck of land.
Iwo Jima was about getting the airfields. The Japanese had built two great airfields on it. They had a lot of Zeros stationed there, and the Zeros could attack our B-29s headed to mainland Japan.
In 1944, the United States Army Air Forces introduced the B-29 Superfortress to combat. Before the war's end, their firebombs would kill 500,000 Japanese. Yet in the months before Iwo Jima was secured, more than 500 crippled B-29s crashed or ditched in the ocean.
They needed a place for emergency landings of B-29s that couldn't make it back to Guam, and so Iwo Jima was chosen.
More important, Iwo. Why? Because to the average Japanese citizen, Iwo Jima was part of the mainland. And for us to take a piece of the mainland 650 miles away, it would be a tremendous psychological blow. So, Iwo Jima was a piece of property we had to have.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
3 years before the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. After the sneak attack, young Americans were eager to enlist.
I hated the Japanese people, the nation. I'd never met a Japanese man or heard of, spoken to anybody, but they did a despicable thing.
Of course, I had animosity against all Japanese, because all Japanese, as far as I was concerned, had attacked us at Pearl Harbor. And I had to even that score. I had to gain back what we lost. I had to do more than that. I had to go and teach them a lesson.
We were told that our freedom was threatened to be taken away. I want to join the Marine Corps to protect that freedom. And I never dreamed that I would go anywhere except in America. I thought everyone going in the military was to protect people from being able to invade America. I had no idea that we would be going someplace else and we would be the invader.
At 91, Woody Williams is the last of 27 Medal of Honor recipients from the Battle of Iwo Jima. But killing did not come easily, even amidst valor.
When I was raised as a farm boy, we were absolutely told you do not kill anything unless it is for food or to get it out of its misery. So when I went into the Marine Corps, it was very difficult for me to change that philosophy that now you've got to take a life of somebody, and they had to convince you that that somebody was an enemy. If you don't kill them, they are going to kill you.
I didn't want to fight. I was forced into it. I didn't hate our enemy and had no personal interest in the war. I had no desire to harm anyone and couldn't understand why we were trying to kill each other.
To prepare for the invasion, American air forces pounded Iwo Jima in the longest sustained aerial offensive of the war, 72 days.
Our job was to kill Japanese. That's the job, that's the purpose of war. The pure purpose of war is to kill your enemy. And the Japanese were our enemy.
Yet the aerial assault had little effect on miles of Japanese-built underground bunkers and dugouts, only on the soldiers and sailors in them.
Some people were buried alive from direct hits on their bunkers. The ground is sand, so it can absorb a lot of damage. The northern areas and Mount Suribachi were hardened lava rock and were natural bunkers that gave protection to the troops. There were many areas that were hand-dug from softer sandstone.
The problem with Iwo Jima is we were on it. They were in it. They were in it because they had 14 miles of tunnels.
Although American intelligence did not know the extent of the Japanese defenses, they assumed the enemy was well entrenched. To soften the island's fortifications and to create a blockade, the largest armada that had ever been assembled in the Pacific surrounded the island's 22,000 Japanese defenders. The U.S. fleet carried nearly 70,000 men to guarantee the capture of Iwo Jima. It was considered that critical.
They appeared as small dots far out to sea. The dots became larger and more distinct as they drew close. I thought it was incredible. How could they still have so many ships?
They knew they were in deep problems on Iwo Jima. They couldn't get any reinforcements. They couldn't get any resupply.
An island with no water. It truly was a hellish island. A lot of men starved to death. They were ravaged by lice and became just skin and bones. We could not bury them because the rocky floor of the bunker was too hard. The dead bodies stayed underground with us. Then the ships began firing. The shells were hitting about 3 or 4 kilometers away from me and raised so much dirt, dust, and smoke that I couldn't see Mount Suribachi. It was death and chaos.
When we got on board ship, not knowing where we were going, they brought out a board, and they had this thing that looked like a pork chop on it, drawn out, it lined out on it, and the briefer was telling us this is where we're going to go, and it's called Iwo Jima. We'll probably be gone for about 5 days because the island is only 2.5 miles wide, 5 miles long. So everybody thought it was a piece of cake, a little 2.5 miles by 5 miles. Well, you can walk across that in a day. You know, just walk. And I think that's what we thought we were going to do.
The beach that we're going to land on now looks to be very hot from here. And there we've hit the beach. We're moving away from the half-track now. The men are motioning to each other to move forward.
The first wave of Americans to hit the beach faced little enemy fire. But this was by design. The Japanese strategy was to get as many Marines as possible onto land, where they could be shot in concentration. It was a deadly plan that would put thousands of Marines directly in their enemy's crosshairs.
I'll tell you flat out, when I was 23 years on Iwo Jima, I didn't think I'd get to my 24th birthday, which is the next month. I didn't ever think I'd get through the war. I landed almost 20 minutes after 9, tried to find the nearest bomb crater that we could find. We couldn't dig a foxhole because you couldn't shovel it out faster than it came back in. The first bomb crater that I went into, one of my sergeants, a Sergeant Leonard Ash, was already in there, and one of his legs was badly shattered. He said, "Captain, help me, help me." In officer school at Quantico, I was trained to understand that you can't stop and concern yourself with one man. You got 200 plus others that under your control. So I said to Len, I've got to go. And with that, I took off. And boy, that was hard.
The defenses that would prove so lethal to the Americans were designed by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Koribayashi. The Harvard-educated, fifth-generation samurai knew he would die in this desolate, hopeless place. He ordered each of his men to take the lives of 10 Americans before being killed or killing themselves. Being taken alive was an unthinkable shame.
I thought that if I was ever captured and sent back to Japan, I would be executed. I thought if captured, I could never return home. Everyone in my squad was issued a single hand grenade. It was to be used to kill ourselves. We knew we had lost even before the battle began. I don't think there was even one person who truly believed we could win. Iwo Jima was Japanese territory. It was our native land. It was what we had to do, so we did it. There was no other choice.
The Japanese have an expression that says, duty is heavier than a mountain, life is lighter than a goose down feather. And these men are taught this from the time they're very young. You must fulfill your duty. Your life has no meaning. So if you're given a task, protect this gun, protect this mountain, take this hill, whatever it is, you must fulfill your duty.
The motivation then to the Japanese defenders was, I'm here to die for my emperor. The attitude of my young Marines was, man, let's get this over with and go home.
I think the difference between the Japanese and the American was that we had a different value of life. It was our instinct to survive.
Corporal Woody Williams had much to live for, including a girl back home.
Her name was Ruby. So she went to the dime store and bought a wee little ring that had a wee small ruby in it. And she gave me that ring and told me that every time you look at this ring, you think of me. My assistant, flamethrower demolition man, he had a ring that his dad had given him before he left for the Marine Corps. Vernon and I, we made a pact that if anything happened to either one of us, we would take the ring and send it back to the family. He'd return mine to Ruby, and I'd return his to Dad. Well, never thinking that that would ever happen.
On March 6, Woody Williams was hit. A corpsman removed still hot shrapnel from Woody's leg and ordered him back to an aid station. Woody refused. He had already lost close friends. He was not about to leave this fight.
Vernon was running by me, still in the advance, and he was running by me, and a mortar came in and hit him dead center. So I ran to him, see if he was gone, and he was. He was already gone. And that's when I took the ring off. To me, that was the worst moment on Iwo Jima, because he was closer to my brothers, really. After the war was over, I came home and I delivered that ring to his dad. You would have thought I was delivering Fort Knox because of the impact that it had upon that family.
It's very common knowledge that on the battlefield, you don't hear the one that gets you. And I didn't hear this one. One thing I clearly remember, I was lying there on a stretcher, and some Marine said, do you want a cigarette? What I remembered was when John Wayne was wounded, he always had a cigarette. So I said yes. So he gave me a cigarette, and I smoked about half of it. The bleeding didn't stop, the pain didn't stop, so I haven't smoked since.
Captain Snowden talked his way back into combat, despite his wounds, only to be wounded again while his company hammered against a stronghold called Hill 362, one of Iwo Jima's toughest defenses. To the south, a natural defense point of the island was Mount Suribachi, but Kuribayashi had added a 7-story fortification inside the 556-foot mountain. Taking this heavily defended high point was one of the Marines' first objectives, and this single mission would result in the most iconic photograph of World War II. On the 5th day of combat, a 40-man patrol was given a daunting order. Scale Mount Suribachi, overtake the well-entrenched, heavily armed enemy, and, if they survived, plant an American flag atop Iwo Jima. The men reached the top of Suribachi, but the banner they flew was too small to be clearly seen. The battalion commander ordered a larger one to be raised, one that could be seen across the entire island and by all the ships surrounding it. This second, larger flag had been carried across the Pacific from Pearl Harbor. February 23, 1945. A single photograph captured the most famous and reproduced image of World War II, and perhaps of all time. It's difficult to overstate the impact this picture had on the war effort here in the States. Yet the iconic photo was almost never taken. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal was positioning himself for the shot on top of Mount Suribachi when the second flag was suddenly being raised. Barely able to swing his camera up, he snapped the shot. And for 1/400th of a second, time and history stood still. Rosenthal had been rejected for military service due to his poor eyesight. He would later say he was lucky to catch the perfect shot. Because the second flag went up about noon, the light gave the figure sculptural depth. Rosenthal also noted that the 20-foot pipe the men found for a flagpole was heavy, and that the effort it took to lift it imparted a feeling of action. He was always modest about his Pulitzer Prize-winning photo, saying, "I took the picture of the flag being raised, but the Marines took Iwo Jima."
Our morale was very low at that point in time. It really was, because we had lost so many people. And I think that really boosted our spirit.
The US flag went up on the afternoon of the 23rd. We felt that Suribachi had fallen. Since Iwo Jima was my assigned place to die, my only wish was to die instantly and not die a horrible, slow death. I hoped that I wouldn't get hit in the legs or arms, but get killed right away with a shot to the head.
Despite this photo becoming synonymous with American victory, it was taken on the 5th day of the 36-day battle. Thousands more sacrifices were yet to come before victory could truly be claimed.
There were about 800 pillboxes on Iwo Jima. They were very effective because they usually were placed in a position where one pillbox could see another pillbox, and you couldn't get the one without the other one being able to see you. They had automatic weapons. They had what they called a Nambu, which was like our .30 caliber machine gun. So they had all the advantage. Trying to approach the pillboxes, that's where we lost so many of our Marines. And that's where we lost the 6 Marines that were in my unit when we hit the shore. And by the day the flag went up, I had lost those, but I didn't have anybody left. My commanding officer said to me that I think I could knock out any of the pillboxes with a flamethrower. I said, I'll try. And I went out and grabbed a flamethrower and strapped it on and said, let's go get them.
Alone in what the Marines called the killing zone, completely exposed to Japanese crossfire, Woody Williams spent 4 hours taking out 7 enemy pillboxes with his flamethrower.
I was approaching a pillbox, and he's firing his Nambu, and the bullets are ricocheting off of my flamethrower. Now, fortunately, they ricocheted up instead of down, or I wouldn't be here. By crawling forward, I got to a point where he couldn't lower his machine gun anymore, and he couldn't get me. And I got him. Approaching another pillbox, and they came charging out. I still had some fuel left, so I hit them with that flame. They were all burning. There's nothing like the odor of a human being burned. I think my life was defined by those 4 hours unknowingly.
Our mission first was to help the Marines to strafe the island. We dropped 500-pound bombs, a yard at a time, wherever there was a yellow marker on the Japanese side. And we dropped napalm into caves.
The night I was hit, I saw a flash of light and heard a crash and rolling thunder just like in a summer storm. Then the shell crashed into the ground. I felt the wind blowing on my hands and legs, but it hurt like being hit by a baseball bat. I struggled to breathe and couldn't get to my feet. The naval shells were falling to the left and right, sending shrapnel buzzing and whistling through the air around me. "If you're going to hit me, just hit me," I shouted at the incoming shells.
He woke up in a field hospital, and he learned that a U.S. Army soldier with the 147th Infantry Regiment had a dog with him, and the dog had sniffed out Akikusa at the entrance to the cave. And instead of shooting him, this American soldier pulled him out. And they tended his wounds and gave him food and water.
To an American, It is an honor to become a prisoner of war after doing one's best in battle. In Japan, there is no worse shame than becoming a POW.
During the combat phase, we captured fewer than 1,000 POWs, and most of those were so badly injured they could not take their own life. No matter how much they may have wanted to keep their pledge, they simply couldn't do it.
I was rescued by an American who showed no animosity towards me. I was his enemy, but he saved me. I wonder if a Japanese soldier would have done the same for a wounded American. I don't think so. I think if the situation were reversed, a Japanese soldier would have left his enemy to die. The American fighting man was unique. There is something about their national character that makes them merciful. It is to an American that I owe my life, and I wish to thank them in person.
When he returned to Japan, Akikusa made it to his family's home, and his mother must have thought he was a ghost. He had never written to his parents the whole time he was a POW. He was too ashamed. His parents told him, "There's a funeral going on at the elementary school for you right now." The town was holding a joint funeral for all 15 young men who died in the war, who never came home. So Akikusa ran to the elementary school. He quietly walked up, removed his photo and the funeral box that was supposed to contain his bones, and sat in the back of the gymnasium and attended his own funeral.
After 16 lethal days of combat, the airfields were finally secure enough to allow American P-51 pilot Jerry Yellen and his fellow aviators to land on Iwo Jima.
We landed with an open canopy, and when we cut our speed down, I looked out across my wing, and I saw mounds and mounds of dead Japanese bodies being pushed into mass graves. And trucks were lined up full of American bodies. And I smelled a smell that I couldn't identify, an overwhelming, overpowering, sick, sweet smell of dead bodies. And I'll never forget that.
According to one Marine, victory was never in doubt. Its cost was. What was in doubt in all our minds was whether there would be any of us left to dedicate our cemetery at the end, or whether the last Marine would die knocking out the last Japanese gunner.
I landed with 231. 36 days later, when we marched off the island, there were 99 of us to walk off.
As the battle ended, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz described the Americans who fought on the island in words that would be engraved in military history. Uncommon valor was a common virtue.
We achieved our objective, which was to capture the island and get those airfields up and running, and it turned out to have tremendous strategic value in more ways than one.
While the battle for Iwo Jima did not end the war in the Pacific, it hastened Japan's ultimate surrender. The nation was devastated by losing its first piece of homeland. And with the capture of Iwo Jima's 2 airfields, American planes could safely take off and return from bombing raids over Japan. Still, the island had one more part to play in the history of World War II. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 called the Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island, carrying the first atomic bomb. She was joined by 2 escort planes before heading to the target of Hiroshima. Their rendezvous point? Iwo Jima.
I think we saved a lot of lives, and probably include my own, by the use of the atomic weapon. as cruel as it sounds then and sounds now. If we had found it necessary to invade the homeland, the casualties, I think, would have exceeded 1 million.
When the war ended in August, it was a tremendous celebration. I mean, it really was. You talk about people running out and firing the weapons into the air, that's what we did.
A month after the war ended, 22-year-old Herschel Woody Williams was summoned to Washington, D.C. by his commander-in-chief. In recognition of the 4 hours he spent single-handedly taking out so many deadly enemy pillboxes, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. He reports being more nervous meeting President Truman than facing the Japanese.
The president in my photo has his left hand holding me by the back of the neck. And I've always said to myself, he's trying to keep me from jumping out of my shoes, is what he's trying to do, because I was just shaking tremendously. I have asked myself, why me? 2 Marines gave their lives protecting mine. So I have said, ever since I received it, it's theirs. I just wear it in their honor. November the 5th, 1945, they handed me a piece of paper that says it was a discharge. Go back to where you were prior to World War II. Well, that's impossible. You can't in 24 hours switch the switch on and switch the switch off to say, okay, everything is forgiven. I don't have to think about this anymore. Well, it never goes away. It's always there. And it's there today.
Despite the battlefield ghosts that stalk both Japanese and American survivors, these are the only former enemies of any war that come together to honor the fallen of both sides.
I think Iwo Jima was unique because such a small piece of real estate, 8 square miles only, with nearly 100,000 troops on it, that so many casualties could occur in such a short time, that it stands out as a very unique battle in our history.
On the island of Iwo Jima, there is a memorial across from the landing beaches. The granite shrine is inscribed in English on the side facing the ocean and in Japanese facing inland. It reads, "We commemorate our comrades, living and dead, who fought here with bravery and honor, and we pray together that our sacrifices on Iwo Jima will always be remembered and never be repeated." In 1995, Lieutenant General Larry Snowden spearheaded an annual event that would be called the Reunion of Honor. At this most unusual gathering, both sides would come together on Iwo Jima for a ceremony of peace and remembrance. But since the United States had returned Iwo Jima to Japan in 1968, the general now had to seek permission from his former adversaries.
Young Japanese bureaucrats said, "We don't think it's a good idea because you Americans would use this as an opportunity to crow over your victory there." I not only pledged my body, but my whole soul to them that that would not happen.
"20 years after the first annual Reunion of Honor on Iwo Jima, survivors from both sides return for what may be their last time. Some men make the trip back to Iwo Jima to find light in the shadows of war. Others have lived with the darkness for decades.
16 guys that I flew with, I can tell you their names and how they died and what day it was. And I was discharged a captain in December 1945. And there was no detraining from the killing school that I went through.
Killing people, it's not human nature to kill one another. he was in a pretty bad way.
I thought about suicide every day. I had no purpose in life. I spoke to the 16 guys. I didn't sleep at night. I was a basket case. It was undiagnosed. There was nothing known then of what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder.
For Jerry Yellen, a most unlikely family event helped him recover from the war that haunted him and the hatred lingering in his heart.
On March 5th, 1988, nearly 43 years to the day that I landed on Japanese soil on Iwo Jima, I watched my son marry a Japanese woman. The bride's father was a kamikaze pilot. I hated the Japanese people, and then we became family. We have 3 Japanese grandchildren. It's a very emotional moment for me to think of what I thought then and what I think now about other human beings. Because we're all the same.
On the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the battle, over 30 of the remaining American survivors returned to the Western Pacific.
First of all, I want to welcome all of you here. This is the biggest group we've had since 1995.
For some, it is their first trip back since their government sent them 7 decades ago. For most, it will be their last.
I want to make peace with myself. I want to meet the guys from Japan and just shake their hands and give them a hug and say, it's okay. We were together now.
En route to Iwo Jima, the group stops on Guam for historical seminars and some last-minute orders for the single day they will have on the island.
You understand that when you go to Iwo Jima with this group, we're going up there for the primary mission to salute those on both sides who gave their lives there. We have never had a single incident on island that refutes my promise to the Japanese. Now, I will tell you, a retired Navy dentist showed up, and he was wearing a necklace of Japanese gold teeth that he had extracted on the battlefield. And when I saw that, I said to him, "Doctor, take that necklace off. And if I see it again on this trip, we're going to drop you wherever we are." He said, "You can't do that." And I said, "Well, try me."
There is a need in some to go back to where they fought. And not only to go back by themselves, but to take their children or their grandchildren back and say, listen, this is where I fought for freedom. This is where I fought for America.
In previous years, Medal of Honor recipient Woody Williams had refused to go to reunions of honor in protest over the U.S. government returning the island to Japan. But at the urging of his grandsons, Woody is going back for the first time.
I anticipate being a little nervous when we get there. I'm more anxious about the flag that I'm going to take back. I'm going to take a flag back that belonged to a Marine that brought it home as a souvenir, but I'm a little anxious of how they're going to receive that.
It's a very special day because we have a very special Japanese visitor with us today. We have one of the Japanese defenders who is here with us today.
This is Mr. Tsuruji Akikusa. Mr. Akikusa is one of the very few surviving Japanese combat survivors of the battle for Iwo Jima.
Dan, ask him where he was wounded and on what date was he wounded and how was he taken prisoner.
He and 7 other men were delivering a message above ground running through trenches on March 1st, 1945, when they were struck by a naval shell. It ripped off the tips of his fingers on his right hand. He had a piece of shrapnel towed right through his left thigh and shrapnel embedded in his lower back and throughout his body. He said he was covered in wounds with lice and fleas and maggots eating his open wounds. He said that there was no one available to help him. All the other Japanese had been killed or burned alive in the caves and bunkers. He felt he was completely alone. Thank you very much. We asked Mr. Akikusa, when were you captured? He will say, I was rescued. I was saved. And he said if I could meet that American soldier, I would thank him. Because of his kindness, I got married. I had kids. I had a job. I had a wonderful home. I have grandkids. And he said, I've lived a wonderful life. And he said, it's because of that soldier.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, welcome to United Airlines Flight 2270 with service to Iwo Jima, Japan.
That it?
Oh my goodness, that's it.
That's it. This is where we would have gone in. This area, straight across there.
That's where you would have gone in?
Yeah.
For a survivor who's going back the first time, he suddenly gets his memory refreshed about what he did and how many buddies he lost. And that's the first thing that pops into your mind is the friends that you lost.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to welcome you all to the island of Iwo Jima. Local time here is approximately 7:30.
It is hard to put my feelings into words, but perhaps there is 1% of me that is happy about going back.
Every time I'll have one or more veterans who come to me and say, General, I didn't want to make this trip. I didn't think I wanted to ever see this place again, but I'm so glad I did. I now have a better appreciation of how I lost my buddies. I have a better appreciation of what this whole thing was about. And then he puts his head on my shoulder and he cries. And last year when I left that hangar on the airplane, my lapel was wet from tears from those guys. Let's go over there where the flag mark is. Flag. That's where flag went up.
But you've leveled 280.
General Snowden. Thank you, sir. Great. Awesome. Thank you. Yes, sir. Okay. All right. Thank you, buddy.
Yes, sir. I'm glad to get back to see the difference in what it looked like when I was here and the difference in the picture that I had in my mind. My mind, it was more hilly, it was barren, there were nothing to hide behind, and it doesn't look anything like what I thought it would look like. So I'm happy to be back, and yet sad because I lost some very close Marines here 70 years ago. Marines don't cry, at least in public. Had to flick them off, sneaky, you know.
Remembering how thirsty he was, Tsurugi Akikusa shared a sip of water with his comrades who remain here.
It is a time of peace, so I want to pray for the souls of the dead. It feels like I am returning to my lonely hometown. I am not excited or happy about returning to Iwo Jima. I feel deeply saddened and can never forget the battle.
When I go back to Iwo Jima and I put my feet on the black sands again, if I close my eyes and put my hands over my ears, I can still hear gunfire, rifle shots. It's there. And I remember it very well. You have to go back and remember the young Marines that I lost there, some of whom died in my arms. And it's an experience that I don't really want to forget. We're very glad that you're here to join us. It's a great day. We appreciate very much your participation, right?
Returning to Iwo Jima takes a physical and emotional toll on men now in their 90s. Yet survivors from both sides of the Pacific are beckoned to come together on the former battlefield for the reunion of honor. "94-year-old Lieutenant General Larry Snowden is the highest-ranking American survivor of the Battle of Iwo Jima alive today. He has spent the last 20 years working with the Japanese government to ensure that families on both sides of this battle can return to honor the dead. Japan only opens the island one day a year, and only for this reunion.
You can't just jump on an airplane and go to Iwo under any circumstance. Just they don't allow it. You have to understand that ancestor worship is vital in the Japanese culture. And the only way bereaved families in Japan can get to Iwo to worship their ancestors is to go to the reunion of honor.
Today's commemorative ceremony is an exceptional event in the world as it unites former enemies to pray for everlasting friendship and eternal peace.
I'd like to begin by thanking the Japanese government for hosting a reunion of honor and for their valued partnership and friendship. United States Marines are particularly proud of the relationship that we have with the Japanese people.
Iwo Jima is the only place in the world where former adversaries can come together to co-host a memorial service.
When I first stood on this island in February of 1945, our two nations were at war. As I stand here, March of 2015, the atmosphere of hatred has changed friendship. Domo. Arigato.
Iwo Jima is basically a tomb to the Japanese. We need to remember that it is a graveyard, and for every step you take, there could be a Japanese soldier lying right beneath your feet.
I just felt a great feeling of relief of the end of the war. The war was over for me, finally, and it is. I really feel that I'm in the prime of my life at age 91. My goal, I would like to be the last man standing who served his country in World War II.
Each year that we make this return trip to Iwo Jima, we appeal to those going on a trip that if they have any souvenirs that their family members have brought home from Iwo Jima, to take them back and give them back to the Japanese.
70 years and so many days ago,
70年前
a Marine collected a soldier's flag, a Japanese soldier's flag. If we could find family, it should go to family.
そしてもしこの遺族の方を探すことができれば返すべきだと彼も思っています。In Japan, if grandchildren receive something like this, they would be proud of a treasure like this.
Can he tell us of some of the meanings on the flag?
It seems like people's name on it.
Names?
Names.
The Japanese got these flags from their families. They call them yosegaki, which means flag with writing on it. And the Japanese family members and friends and neighbors and co-workers would write wishes on there.
Usually it's written for whom it belongs to. This is the person's name, most likely. Probably, most likely Takimoto.
Okay. It was such a pleasure to return the flag. Thank you very much. To meet somebody that was on the other side. I can't understand him, he can't understand me, but we can still be friends. And so I think I made a new friend today.
When Mr. Akikusa returned to Japan, he was miraculously able to find the flag owner's son, who was only 3 when his father died. The Takimoto family was grateful for the return of their family's long-lost treasure.
The Prime Minister of Japan.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the gallery today is Lieutenant General Lawrence Snowden. 70 years ago, he landed on Iwo Jima. Next to General Snowden sits Yoshitaka Shindo. His grandfather, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the Japanese garrison during the Battle of Iwo Jima. What should we call this, if not the miracle of history?
What lessons do the younger generation need to know from the Iwo Jima experience? I want them to look at the War Memorial and understand that what they have today is because young men like those did what they did when they did it. And their status today as free citizens, capable of making their own decisions and speaking the language they choose, did not come about as a pure gift from God. Freedom has to be paid for. If they want their children to enjoy freedom as they have, they may have to step up to the plate and pay a price for it. I'm often asked, was it worth it? My answer is, well, it depends on where you sit in the equation. If you lost your son there, you would say, no, it's not worth it. If you step back and think in broad terms of what it did to bring the war in the Pacific to an end, yes, it was worth it.
4 out of every 5 men who fought on this island would either be killed or wounded. 28,000 died protecting or seizing this piece of volcanic rock. Thousands of Japanese are still entombed here.
I have one request. Please maintain the peace for even one more day. Without peace, the loss of over 3 million of my countrymen's lives is meaningless. I feel like it was their lives that were used to secure peace. If there is no peace, what did all of them die for?
Iwo Jima From Combat to Comrades is available on DVD. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call 1-800-PLAY-PBS.